The ballroom at Hartwell House held 60 candles for every guest, and Rosalind Ashby had counted them without meaning to. She stood at the outer edge of the assembled company, her gray gown catching none of the light that the room lavished so freely on Lady Cecily Vane's ivory silk, on the diamonds at the dowager's throat, on the silver thread worked through the gown of every woman whose dress had been chosen for precisely this arena. The gray was clean and well-pressed and entirely honest, which was more than could be said for most things in the room. It had been her mother's, let out at the hem and taken in at the waist by Rosalind's own hands over 3 successive evenings, the needle moving by candlelight while the solicitor's letter still sat on the writing desk in the rented lodging, its seal broken, its contents memorized. £4,000. That was the number the solicitor had spoken in a voice of measured regret, as though the figure itself required an apology. £4,000. Her father's debts, inherited not in law, but in the only currency that actually circulated in this world, which was reputation. Mr. Ashby had been a kind man and a poor accountant, and he was 6 weeks in the ground, and what he had left his daughter was a grief she could not yet afford to feel, and a social position that depended entirely on Mrs. Denholm's willingness to continue vouching for her. Mrs. Denholm stood 3 feet to Rosalind's left, her broad back half turned, already absorbed in a conversation with a woman in violet taffeta whose name Rosalind had not been given. This was the nature of Mrs. Denholm's chaperonage. She was present, technically, in the way that a borrowed umbrella is present when the sky is only slightly threatening. Rosalind did not blame her. Mrs. Denholm had her own position to protect, her own daughters to settle, and whatever goodwill had moved her to bring her distant cousin's daughter to the winter ball at Hartwell was a goodwill with clearly legible limits. What Rosalind did not yet know, as she stood with her back to the tall windows and tried to decide whether a glass of ratafia would improve or worsen her situation, was that the Earl of Hartwell had already seen her. She had not noticed him notice her, because she had not yet learned the particular quality of his attention. She had watched him cross the room with Lady Cecily on his arm, had observed the measured correctness of his escort, had taken in the breadth of his shoulders and the severe cut of his dark coat, and the way every conversation in the room adjusted its angle slightly to account for his presence, the way a compass needle adjusts to true north. He was 32 years old, and he had held the earldom for 4 years, and everything about his bearing suggested that he had earned the right to be cold, although what he had paid for that right was not yet visible to her. She had looked at him the way she looked at the room's chandelier, as a feature of the architecture, and returned her attention to the problem of the ratafia. He had not looked at her that way at all. Mrs. Denholm's conversation migrated across the room on a current of violet taffeta, and Rosalind allowed herself to breathe more fully, with the small relief of not being supervised. She moved along the wall toward the tall windows that overlooked the east garden, where snow had been falling since mid-afternoon and now lay in 2 inches of unbroken white on the stone balustrade. She did not know Hartwell House well enough to find it beautiful. Not yet. But the garden under snow had a stillness that the ballroom, for all its candlelight, could not produce. Lady Cecily Vane laughed at something the Earl said. The sound carried cleanly across the room, practiced and clear, the laugh of a woman who had trained it like a garden bird. She was standing now near the Dowager Countess, the 3 of them arranged in the room's center as though the balance of all 60 guests depended on their triangulation. The Dowager was a woman of 60, with jet beads at her collar and a fan of painted ivory held at a height that suggested she had calculated its precise authority. She had arranged this evening, Rosalind understood, in the way that generals arrange campaigns. Every pairing planned, every seating deliberate, every entrance timed. Rosalind had not been arranged. Rosalind was a gap in the arrangement, a gray smudge at the margin of a painting that had been composed without her. She pressed 2 fingers briefly to the pulse at her wrist, a habit from childhood, a way of reminding herself that her body was real and present when the room seemed determined to forget it. Her pulse was steady. She had that. What happened next began with sound rather than sight. A sharp voice from the corridor that opened off the ballroom's far end, past the second set of doors, where the passage led down toward the kitchens. The voice belonged to a footman who had clearly been drinking, and what he was saying to the girl he had cornered was not something Rosalind could parse at this distance, but the pitch of the girl's distress was entirely audible. A small, high, effortful silence. The silence of someone trying very hard not to cry, and losing the contest. No one else appeared to hear it. The musicians were in the middle of a country dance, and the assembled 60 were engaged in the business of the evening, and the corridor was not quite close enough. Rosalind set her untouched glass on the nearest surface, which happened to be the ledge of the window, and walked toward the sound. The corridor was lit by a single wall sconce, and in its unsteady light, Rosalind could see the kitchen maid clearly, a girl of perhaps 14. In a white cap and an apron that was too large for her, pressed against the wall beside a service door, with her tray at an angle that suggested she had been trying to pass and had been prevented. The footman was not touching her, quite. But he was standing in a way that made touching unnecessary, his body blocking the passage, his voice low and contemptuous in the way that men's voices become when they are certain no one important is listening. "You dropped the glass," he was saying, "and I will have you reported to the housekeeper, and you will be turned out before morning, unless you care to be a good deal more agreeable than you've managed tonight." The girl's name, Rosalind would learn later, was Bess. Bess was pressing her lips together with the determined ferocity of someone who had been told, probably many times, that crying was the worst possible response to a situation like this. Rosalind stepped fully into the corridor, placed herself squarely between Bess and the footman, and said in the clearest voice she possessed, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Please tell Mrs. Bramley that I require a fresh glass of claret, and that this young woman will carry it up when she is ready. You may go." The footman stared at her. She was wearing a gray gown, and she had no jewels, and she was not anyone he could identify, which meant she could be anyone at all, and that uncertainty was precisely enough. He straightened, recalculated, and left. Rosalind turned to Bess and said, more quietly, "Are you hurt?" Bess shook her head. Her eyes were very bright, and her chin was still pressed stubbornly level. "Good," Rosalind said. "Take a moment. Then go up the back stairs, not the passage. There is no broken glass, and if anyone says otherwise, tell them to speak to me." She did not know whether that offer had any value at all in this house. She suspected it had very little. She made it anyway. She was not aware, as she turned to walk back toward the ballroom, that the gallery above the corridor was occupied. The Earl of Hartwell had stepped away from the ballroom midway through the second dance, under the pretext of examining the condition of the east corridor's ceiling plaster, which had been worrying the estate manager since October. He had been standing at the gallery rail for 4 minutes when he heard the footman's voice. He had been standing there for 8 minutes when Rosalind Ashby stepped into the passage and did what she did. He watched her walk back toward the ballroom. He watched the set of her shoulders, the deliberate evenness of her pace, the way she did not look back at the service door to see whether Bess was following her instruction. She had given the instruction as though it would be followed. She had not needed to confirm it. He descended from the gallery by the back stairs and re-entered the ballroom through the main doors, and no one noticed that he had been absent, because he had trained the room for 4 years not to mark his movements too carefully. His mother was at his elbow within 30 seconds. "You have been away from Lady Cecily for nearly a quarter hour," the dowager said, without varying the pleasant public expression she maintained as readily as other women maintained their posture. Lady Cecily appeared well occupied, he said. She appeared attentive, which is not the same thing. Robert, the evening has a purpose. I ask you to remember it. He looked at his mother and then at Lady Cecily, who was indeed attentive, her pale head inclined toward Lord Fenton's anecdote, her smile timed with precision. She was beautiful and well-connected, and she would make an excellent Countess of Hartwell, and he had known this for 3 months, and knowing it had not moved him at all. And he had been telling himself that the absence of movement was irrelevant. That movement of that kind was a luxury he had already surrendered. He returned to Lady Cecily's side and offered his arm, and the evening reconstituted itself around him in the shape his mother had designed. Rosalind, across the room, did not look up when he passed. He was aware of this in a way that had no practical application. If you are finding yourself uncertain whether she will have the courage to stay, the answer is yes, but the cost of staying will be higher than she knows. Stay close. The evening's middle hours produced the sequence the Dowager had planned. A promenade, a supper table arranged so that Lady Cecily sat at the Earl's right hand, a card table where Rosalind was conspicuously not invited to join. Mrs. Denholm had reattached herself to Rosalind's vicinity after supper, which was more attention than she had paid before it. And Rosalind understood that something in the room had shifted, and that whatever that shift was, it had not shifted in her favor. She learned the nature of it from the Dowager herself. The Dowager did not seek her out directly. That was not how it was done. What happened was that Rosalind, retrieving her shawl from the chair where she had left it, found herself adjacent to a small cluster of women that included Lady Fenton and a Miss Worthington whose mother had come up from Bath for the season, and the Dowager moved into the cluster with the ease of a ship entering a harbor it owns. "Miss Ashby," the Dowager said, addressing her pleasantly, with the fan held at its precise calculated height. "I believe you are connected to Mrs. Denholm through her mother's side?" "Through her father's," Rosalind said. "My mother was a Denholm by birth." "How useful," the Dowager said, and the word useful landed with the weight of a sentence, not an adjective. "I had heard that Mr. Ashby's affairs were somewhat complicated at the time of his death. One hopes there is family to assist with complications of that nature." Lady Fenton's eyes moved sideways and found something of great interest in the carpet. Miss Worthington's mother drew her fan open. "My father's estate is being settled," Rosalind said, in the voice she had learned to keep level when her heartbeat was not. "There is nothing complicated that time will not resolve." £4,000, the Dowager said, as lightly as she might say the weather has been quite cold, "is a good deal of time." The figure had apparently been circulating. Rosalind had not known this, and she absorbed the knowledge without expression, which cost her something she could not measure. "A debtor's daughter at the Hartwell ball," Lady Fenton said, to no one in particular, her voice a murmur that carried cleanly. "One does wonder what Mrs. Denholm was thinking." The Dowager moved on. She had accomplished what she intended in approximately 90 seconds, and she had not raised her voice once. Rosalind stood with the shawl in her hands and breathed carefully, the way she had learned to breathe when her father's news had first arrived, when the solicitor's letter had been read, when grief and debt arrived in the same morning's post. She was, she reminded herself, still standing. She was still in the room. She had not been asked to leave. She did not yet know that the Earl had heard the words £4,000 spoken in his mother's voice from a distance of 15 feet, and that something in his face had gone very still. The night moved through its later hours. in the way that difficult evenings do, slower than they should, and louder. Rosalind exchanged pleasantries with a retired colonel's wife who did not appear to know about the 4,000 pounds, and she declined a second glass of ratafia, and she watched Lady Cecily dance twice more with the Earl. He was a precise dancer, controlled and measured, his attention properly placed on his partner. He did not look across the room. There was no reason he should. She was watching the snow at the window again, thinking about the cost of the carriage home and whether it would be indecent to ask Mrs. Denholm to leave at 10 rather than 11. When she heard the dowager's voice from the withdrawing room, whose door stood 2 inches ajar, she was not eavesdropping. She was simply standing in a place where sound traveled honestly. "It will be announced at the second ball," the dowager was saying. "The solicitor has drawn the settlement. Lady Cecily's father has given his agreement in principle." A second voice, which Rosalind did not immediately recognize as Robert's, said, "There are further considerations." "There are none," the dowager said, with the calm certainty of a woman who has not encountered a consideration she could not resolve. "Robert, you have delayed this arrangement for 3 months. Cecily Vane is an excellent match in every particular that the family requires. The engagement will be announced at Lord Fenton's ball on the 14th. Your further considerations are a luxury." Silence. Not a long silence, but a weighted one. "Very well," he said. 2 words. The same weight as a stone dropped in still water. Rosalind stepped back from the door. Her hands were perfectly quiet at her sides. Her pulse was doing something she did not wish to examine at present. She had come to Hartwell on the faint, unexamined possibility that the evening might produce something other than confirmation of what the world had already decided about her, and the world had, with its usual efficiency, confirmed everything. She found Mrs. Denholm in the card-room and said, in a voice of entirely composed regret, that she had a slight headache, and wondered whether they might request the carriage. Mrs. Denholm, whose own evening had not produced whatever she had hoped, agreed with visible relief. Rosalind retrieved her cloak from the hall and walked toward the front of the house where the carriages were arranged along the drive, the horses patient and steaming in the cold air, their breath rising in small clouds above the snow-covered gravel. The night was completely quiet outside the house, the kind of quiet that comes only with snowfall, as though the world has agreed, briefly, to lower its voice. She was 3 steps from the carriage when she heard him. "Miss Ashby?" She turned. Robert Stanhope stood in the doorway of the house's side entrance, his dark coat open at the throat, as though he had come out without preparation, without the performance of formality, which was so at odds with everything she had observed of him that she simply looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "My lord," she said, "I am about to leave." "I know," he said. "I saw you ask for the carriage. Then you know there is nothing further required." He came down the 2 steps from the entrance and stopped at a distance that was proper and somehow entirely wrong. Too far and too close at once, the space between them full of the cold that the snow had left in the air. "I want to tell you," he said, and then he stopped, and the stopping was in itself an event, because she understood that this was a man who did not stop in the middle of sentences, without a reason. What my mother said in the card-room. The manner of it. "Your mother said nothing incorrect," Rosalind said. "The sum is accurate. The sum is irrelevant." She looked at him. The candlelight from the hallway behind him caught the angle of his jaw and the deliberate stillness of his face. He was not cold, she realized, not the way she had assumed from across the room. He was held. There was a considerable difference. "My lord," she said, "you have an arrangement that is to be announced at the Fenton Ball on the 14th. I am a woman in a gray gown with 4,000 pounds of her father's debt, and no claim on your attention. I would ask you to let me take my carriage with my dignity intact, because it is all I have managed to keep this evening." He was quiet. She could see, or thought she could, the quality of what the silence cost him. "It is not the arrangement you heard described," he said, finally. "It sounded entirely arranged." "There are things I have permitted," he said, slowly, as though the words were being drawn up from a considerable depth, in the belief that what I had once hoped for was no longer something I was entitled to hope for. I had a wife. Her name was Catherine. She died 3 years ago in childbed, and the child with her. And there were choices I had made in the months preceding it that I cannot undo. I have been telling myself since then that the proper response to that kind of failure is to stop hoping for things that require courage. The snow shifted in the wind, briefly, and then settled. Rosalind heard the honesty in what he had said with the precision of someone who had grown up in a household where honesty was always slightly more expensive than people had planned for. She heard it, and she felt the weight of it, and she did not move toward it, because she did not yet know what it meant. "I am sorry about Catherine," she said. "I am sorry about the child." He received this without defense, which told her more than the words had. "Go home safely," he said. "I will see you at the Fenton ball." She could not read his face in the half-dark, and she did not try. She took Mrs. Denholm's hand up into the carriage, settled into her seat, and watched Hartwell House recede through the snow until the trees at the drive's end closed behind them. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the cold of the carriage glass at her shoulder, and thought about a man who had said, "I will see you at the Fenton ball," in a voice that sounded like a decision rather than a courtesy. She told herself it was a courtesy. The fortnight between the Hartwell ball and Lord Fenton's entertainment was a precise lesson in how a woman in a gray gown, with a dead father's debts, could be arranged by a room without anyone troubling to explain the arrangement. Mrs. Denholm attended 2 morning calls with her, and twice was drawn into conversations about the Hartwell succession, in which Rosalind was not named, though the topic of the Earl's upcoming engagement was discussed with the thoroughness of people who have already been told the conclusion and are merely decorating its frame. The label came at the 2nd morning call from a Miss Bracewell who had been at the Hartwell ball and who spoke with the comfortable authority of someone repeating something she had not invented but thoroughly enjoyed distributing. "That debtor's daughter Mrs. Denholm brought," she said, not bothering to lower her voice in Mrs. Hargrove's yellow drawing room. "Did you not notice the gown? Gray all evening, not a single piece of jewelry. There is something so effortful about pretending things are normal when they are plainly not." Rosalind, who was examining Mrs. Hargrove's arrangement of dried winter roses on the side table, said nothing. She had become very efficient at the specific labor of saying nothing. She wrote to the solicitor twice during those 2 weeks. She sold the small ivory brooch that had been her mother's, the one she had thought to wear to the Hartwell ball, and had put back in its case at the last moment as too fine for her present situation, and the proceeds reduced the 4,000 pounds by exactly 32, which was not nothing, and was also not much. She did not think about the Earl's voice in the dark outside the carriage, saying, "There are things I have permitted in the belief that what I had once hoped for was no longer something I was entitled to hope for." She thought about it no more than 3 or 4 times a day, which she considered a reasonable performance of forgetting. Lord Fenton's ball on the 14th of January occupied 3 rooms of his Grosvenor Square house and held considerably more than 60 guests. The season having turned the corner from its tentative December beginnings into the full mechanical operation that Rosalind had been dreading since October. Mrs. Denholm had been more assiduous in her chaperonage this evening, perhaps because the stakes of the occasion were visible to her. An engagement announcement in a room this size being the kind of event around which positions were shored up or quietly abandoned. Rosalind wore the gray gown again. She had no choice in the matter. She had added a narrow satin ribbon at the neckline, deep green, almost the color of old holly, and she had dressed her hair more carefully than she had at Hartwell, and she had made herself look at her own reflection in the glass before she left the lodging without flinching, because flinching was a luxury she had decided to stop affording. The Dowager arrived with Lady Cecily at 9:30, and the room reorganized itself around their entrance with the practiced ease of a room that had seen this before. Lady Cecily was in pale gold silk, with a spray of white flowers in her hair, and she was, in the flatly honest observation that Rosalind permitted herself, extraordinarily beautiful, the kind of beauty that the season was designed to house, and the marriage market was designed to convert. And whatever the Dowager had arranged was in every visible respect the correct arrangement for the world as it currently operated. The Earl arrived at 9:45. He entered from the north doors, without his mother, without Lady Cecily, without the corrective machinery of the arrangement. He moved across the room's edge with the deliberate quality of a man who has decided something and is in the early process of not changing his mind, and the room's compass needles swung toward him, and then, finding him unaccompanied, swung back in confused recalibration. He found Rosalind in approximately 90 seconds. She was near the east wall with a glass she had not drunk from, and she watched him cross the room toward her with the specific attentiveness of a person who is trying to determine whether an approaching thing is a threat or a rescue, and has not yet concluded the question. "Miss Ashby," he said. "My lord," she said. "Lady Cecily is near the fire." "I know where Lady Cecily is." "Your mother will have observed your direction of travel." "My mother observes everything," he agreed, and something in his face moved briefly in a way that was not quite a smile, but shared several of its qualities. "That is why what I am about to do must be done where she can observe it as clearly as anyone else." Rosalind looked at him. Her pulse was at her wrist and her throat and the heel of her hand where it pressed the glass, every location where the body keeps its honest accounts. "There is nothing," she said, "that requires doing on my account." "There is a great deal," he said quietly, "that is already done." He held out his hand. She looked at it. A plain hand, long-fingered, the slight callus at the base of the index finger from his writing. Not the hand of a man performing a gesture. The hand of a man who had made a calculation and completed it. She could have refused. The thought was very clear and very immediate, the way clear thoughts often are when one is frightened. She could have protected the small amount of dignity she had accumulated over the evening, saved herself from whatever consequence the room was about to produce, and gone home with nothing lost that had not already been lost before she arrived. She put her hand in his. He turned and walked back across the ballroom with Rosalind at his side, and the room's ambient sound did not stop, but it altered. The way sound alters in a gallery when a painting is moved from one wall to another, and people cannot yet articulate what has changed, but sense with certainty that something has. The Dowager stood at the room's center with Lady Cecily and Lord Fenton's mother, and the painted ivory fan held at its precise and customary height. She saw them coming. Rosalind watched the calculation move through her face like weather across a clear sky, swift, involuntary, and not entirely concealed. Lady Cecily's expression was a different kind of weather entirely. She was, Rosalind thought, genuinely surprised, which meant she had understood the evening's design as clearly as the Dowager had, and had not considered that the design might be revised by the one man whose revision of it mattered. The crowd had arranged itself, without being asked, into the kind of loose watching circle that assembles whenever a room senses that the event it was invited to witness is not quite the event that is going to occur. Robert stopped in front of his mother. "I will not be making the announcement you arranged," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am grateful for Lady Cecily's patience, and I wish her every happiness that the season can provide. The engagement will not proceed." The Dowager's fan lowered precisely 2 inches, a minor event, a barely visible adjustment. But Rosalind had learned to read the fan, and she understood that 2 inches was, for the Dowager, equivalent to a long moment of publicly visible disorientation. "Robert," the Dowager said, in the voice she used to restore order, "this is not the occasion." "It is exactly the occasion," he said, "because what I have to say requires the same witnesses who heard you name this woman a debtor's daughter in a room full of people who had no need of the information." The silence had a texture to it now, the specific texture of 60 people breathing carefully. Lady Fenton, who had been near the card tables, had moved without appearing to move, and was now within clear hearing distance. Lord Fenton's mother looked at her fan and then at the ceiling. Miss Bracewell, near the refreshment table, had gone very still. "Her father's debts belong to the past," Robert said, and his voice was level and utterly without performance, the voice of a man stating a condition of the landscape. "Her character belongs to her. I have seen what she does when she believes no one is watching, and it is the same as what she does when she knows the room is watching, which is more than I can say for most of what I have witnessed this season." He turned to look at Rosalind directly, which meant the room looked at her too, which meant she was no longer a gray smudge at the painting's edge, but the thing the painting was organized to contain. "The girl in gray," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made it sound like a title, not a description, a name given to the thing the room had failed to see correctly from the beginning. "Is the woman I intend to marry, if she will have me, and I am asking her here, in front of all of you, because she was dismissed in front of all of you, and it is in front of all of you that I wish to be corrected." He turned to her. The room held. "Rosalind," he said. The first name said aloud, in this space, in this company, was itself an act of significant deliberateness. "Will you?" She had sworn to herself, in the carriage coming here, that she would not cry in public regardless of what the evening produced. She was keeping that promise by a very small margin. "Yes," she said. "I will." The room exhaled, all 60 people breathing in unison as the compression broke, and something warm and slightly dazed moved through the assembly. The sound of witnesses who have watched a correction occur and find, to their own mild surprise, that they are glad of it. The Dowager closed her fan. She looked at her son for a long moment with the expression of a woman who is genuinely recalculating, not performing recalculation, and in that moment she was considerably more sympathetic than she had been all evening. She was, Rosalind thought, a person who had believed entirely in the correctness of her own map, and was confronting, perhaps for the first time in some years, the possibility that the territory had not cooperated. She gave one small nod, so contained it might have been missed, and turned toward Lady Fenton's mother with a composure that was entirely professional. Lady Cecily had moved back from the circle's center, quietly, without drama or display. She was standing now near the north doors, with her white flowers and her pale gold silk, and if she was wounded, she carried it with a privacy that Rosalind genuinely respected. She did not look in their direction again. Mrs. Denholm appeared at the edge of the room's newly reshuffled geography with an expression of considerable surprise and what appeared to be retrospective credit claiming, her whole bearing suggesting that she had known something of the kind was likely from the beginning. Robert kept Rosalind's hand. He did not deliver another speech. He did not require to. The room had already received the only sentence it needed, and everything subsequent was the natural consequence of that sentence settling into the walls of Lord Fenton's ballroom, like warmth settling into stone. "I should tell you," Rosalind said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "that I have £39 toward the 4,000 now. I sold a brooch." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen him use before. Something open, briefly, at the eyes, an undefended place she had not known was there. And that would not, she thought, be easy to reach again, but would be worth the reaching. "Your father's debts will be settled," he said simply. "They are my responsibility," she said. "They are a number," he said, "that I intend to reduce to irrelevance, and then we will not speak of it again, unless you choose to." She found, to her own quiet surprise, that this was acceptable. Not because it resolved the thing, but because he had said it without minimizing the £4,000, without pretending the weight of it had been imaginary. He had named it a number and treated the number honestly, and this was, in its way, the most Regency period romantic statement she had ever received. The carriage home, which was his carriage and not Mrs. Denholm's hired arrangement, moved through the January streets with the particular quietude of a vehicle whose occupants have arrived at a new country and are still mapping its borders. Mrs. Denholm sat across from them with her hands folded and her eyes generously directed at the window, which was fogged with cold. Rosalind sat beside Robert in the wool and cold air proximity of the carriage and thought about the corridor at Hartwell, about Bess with her tilted tray, about a man at a gallery rail watching a gray gown from above. "You were in the gallery," she said. "Yes," he said. "You watched?" "Yes." She turned to look at him in the carriage's dim interior. "And you said nothing that evening. You let me walk back into that room, and you said nothing until the carriage step." "I needed to understand what I had seen before I said anything that could not be unsaid," he said. "I have learned, at some cost, that speaking too late is a great deal less damaging than speaking wrongly." She thought about Catherine, about a man who had made choices he could not undo and had spent 3 years deciding whether the capacity for choice had survived those choices. She thought about the way he had said, "I have been telling myself that the proper response to that kind of failure is to stop hoping for things that require courage." "You were not wrong," she said finally, meaning it for the corridor and the carriage step and the ballroom and all the distance between. To wait. He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was simply, without ornament, in the voice she was beginning to recognize as his most honest register. "No, I was not." Hartwell in February was a different creature than Hartwell in January, the snow thinner and the light longer in the afternoons, the house opening its angles to the pale seasonal sun in a way the winter ball had not prepared her for. Rosalind moved through its rooms in the weeks following their engagement, learning the house the way she had learned everything in the last year of her life. Methodically, specifically, without the comfort of pretending it was easier than it was. The solicitor came on a Thursday and spread his documents across the study table, and the £4,000 was resolved in the way that such things are resolved when an earldom addresses them. Cleanly and without theater, the debt retired in a single transaction, the relevant paperwork signed and witnessed by 2 men in dark coats who packed it away in their cases and left without congratulation. Rosalind signed her own name on the document that confirmed the settlement and pressed her fingers to her wrist once, briefly, and felt her pulse steady under them. The Dowager came to Hartwell in the 3rd week of February, as was her custom for the spring estate review. and she was received with the full courtesy due her station, which included the fact that she was Robert's mother and the house's former mistress, and a woman who, when cornered by a correct reality, was capable of adjusting to it with considerably more grace than her behavior at Two Balls had suggested. She and Rosalind sat together in the morning room on the second day of her visit and drank tea and talked about the kitchen garden with the careful precision of two people who understand that they are negotiating a permanent geography and have both agreed, without saying so, to make it habitable. "You are not what I planned for him," the Dowager said, at the tea's end, holding her cup with both hands in the manner of someone who is being, for once, straightforward. "No," Rosalind said. "He is steadier," the Dowager said. "Than he has been in 3 years?" She did not say anything else on the subject. She did not need to. Bess, who turned out to be the scullery maid assigned to the East Corridor on the night of the ball, was brought up to household maid by the Hartwell housekeeper in March, which was not Rosalind's doing, precisely, though she had mentioned to Mrs. Bramley in passing that the girl had shown considerable good judgment in a difficult moment. Mrs. Bramley was a woman who valued good judgment above most other qualities, and had arrived at the same conclusion independently, which was satisfying in the way that two separate calculations, producing the same correct answer, is satisfying. There was a small painting of Mr. Ashby, a portrait done in watercolor in the year of his marriage, that Rosalind had carried with her from the lodging to Hartwell, in the flat case that held her few good things. It showed him at 30 years old, before the accounts had begun to trouble him, with the look on his face of a man who has just been told something hopeful and has not yet decided whether to believe it. She had kept it wrapped in brown paper during the months of the engagement and the weeks of settling in, uncertain of its right place in a house that was not yet entirely hers. Robert found it when he came into the small sitting room adjacent to their bedroom on a Sunday afternoon in late February and saw her unwrapping it at the writing table. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the portrait, and then at her face, and then at the portrait again. "Where did you think to put it?" he said. "I had not decided," she said. "I was uncertain whether there was a suitable place." He took the portrait from her hands, gently, with the care of someone handling a thing that matters, and walked through to the sitting room's far wall, where a small carved mantelpiece housed a pair of blue and white porcelain pieces that had no particular significance. He moved one of the porcelain pieces to the right and set the portrait in the space he had made. Mr. Ashby in watercolor looked out at the room with his hopeful, unresolved expression. The firelight caught the paper's edge and made it warm. "There," Robert said. Rosalind stood in the doorway of the sitting room with her hands at her sides and let the thing she had been holding since the solicitor's letter arrived in November resolve finally into something she did not have a word for. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly. Something older than both of those and quieter. The feeling of being in a room where she was supposed to be. The fire in the hearth burned steadily. Outside the window, a light snow had begun to fall, unhurried and without drama, covering the east garden where she had first seen the balustrade in white on the night she had come here in a gray gown and been told, in various elegant ways, that she did not belong. She belonged now. The house had her name in its accounts. The man across the room had said it in front of 60 witnesses in Lord Fenton's ballroom, and the words had not been retracted, and the snow was falling on the stone he had placed her portrait above, and her father, in watercolor, looked out at it all with his hopeful expression, as though he had known something of the kind was coming, and had simply been waiting to see the moment arrive. Robert turned from the mantelpiece and found her watching him from the doorway. The fire was between them, orange and steady, casting its warmth equally across the floor. She crossed the room. He did not move toward her, because he understood that the crossing was hers to make, and waited. with the particular patience of a man who had learned that waiting, done correctly, was its own kind of courage. She came to stand beside him at the mantelpiece, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire at her cheek, close enough for her shoulder to press lightly against his arm. And they stood together and looked at her father's face in the firelight. And outside the window the snow continued to fall over the garden in the patient, unhurried way of things that have all the time they need. She found his hand without looking down, and he closed his fingers around hers. This was Hartwell. This was hers. If Rosalind's story found a quiet place in your evening, leave a word in the comments about what stayed with you. There are more stories waiting here, told the same way, with the same steady candle burning.